Zambada participated in the hearing through a Spanish-language interpreter. His lawyers entered the not guilty plea on his behalf. Prosecutors first wanted to try Zambada in El Paso for drug and conspiracy charges, but lawyers agreed he would face the New York charges first.
The walls are closing in on one of Mexico's most notorious drug lords, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, facing charges that could land him behind bars for life, or worse, on death row.
One of the world's most powerful drug cartel leaders appeared in a Texas federal court on Friday. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, leader of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, pleaded not guilty on all charges after being arrested by U.S. federal agents in Texas on Thursday.
El Mayo recently shocked the world by pleading not guilty to a long list of serious crimes in a U.S. court. But make no mistake, his trial is just beginning, and experts believe the outcome could be devastating for him. They're predicting a minimum life sentence, with a very real possibility of the death penalty.
Prosecutors first wanted to try Zambada in El Paso for drug and conspiracy charges.
So how did it come to this? How did a man who stayed hidden in the shadows for so long finally get cornered? And what role did his former ally, El Chapo, play in all of this? In today's video, we're diving deep into El Mayo's terrifying situation. From Chapo's explosive accusations that could make things even worse, to the shocking twists that may determine Mayo's fate.
Prosecutors first wanted to try Zambada in El Paso for drug and conspiracy charges, but lawyers agreed he would face the New York charges first.
Stick around as we uncover the truth behind this legendary cartel leader's downfall and explore the desperate steps he's taking to avoid the ultimate punishment.
Drug kingpin and alleged co-founder of the Sinaloa cartel, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, was in federal court earlier this afternoon. His first physical appearance since being taken into custody by U.S. law enforcement a week ago.
Ismael El Mayo Zambada is one of the most powerful and elusive figures in the world of Mexican drug cartels. While names like El Chapo Guzman might be more familiar, El Mayo has been working in the shadows for decades, quietly building his empire. Unlike many cartel leaders who crave the spotlight, El Mayo has always preferred to operate behind the scenes, staying off the radar and avoiding the attention that has brought down so many other drug lords. Born in 1948 in Sinaloa, Mexico, Zambada grew up in a region where drug trafficking was a way of life for many. But his rise to power wasn't by chance. It was through patience, strategy, and ruthless decisions. By the 1980s, he had become deeply involved in the drug trade, smuggling narcotics like cocaine and heroin into the United States. Over time, El Mayo worked his way up the ranks of the Sinaloa cartel, becoming one of its most influential leaders.
Ismael Zambada is facing 7 federal charges in connection with his role as co-founder of the dangerous Sinaloa cartel, all which he has pled not guilty to.
Despite being at the heart of the cartel's operations, El Mayo's low profile made him hard to catch. His associate, El Chapo, became the public face of the Sinaloa cartel, hogging the media's attention with dramatic escapes and arrests. Mayo, on the other hand, remained in the shadows, using his anonymity as a shield. As Reuters puts it, Zambada, 75, was for decades the leader of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking syndicate, operating in the shadows, while others such as his close associate Joaquin El Chapo Guzman became the more public face of the cartel. While El Chapo's flashy moves got him headlines, El Mayo's careful tactics allowed him to stay out of jail for decades. His influence was undeniable. Under his leadership, the Sinaloa cartel became one of the largest and most feared criminal organizations in the world. He was responsible for moving billions of dollars worth of drugs, establishing smuggling routes that reached the US, Europe, and even Asia.
The 76-year-old founded the criminal organization with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who is currently jailed in the US. Also arrested Thursday alongside Mr. Zambada was the son of the notorious El Chapo Guzman, Joaquin Guzman Lopez. American prosecutors say the Sinaloa cartel is the biggest supplier of drugs to the United States.
Despite his mysterious nature, El Mayo's name became synonymous with power and fear in the Mexican drug war. His reputation as a ruthless but strategic leader made him one of the most wanted men in the world. Yet for years, law enforcement couldn't touch him. In short, El Mayo's ability to stay hidden and avoid capture while building one of the most powerful drug empires is what makes him a legend in the criminal underworld. Now, with his recent arrest and looming trial, the world is finally getting a closer look at the man who was always behind the scenes.
Ismael El Mayo Zambada's leading attorneys were tight-lipped after representing their client in a status hearing before a federal judge. Two key issues were brought up during the conference, the first concerning a conflict of interest involving Zambada's attorneys.
Now let's dive into the recent development in El Mayo's case, his arrest, and the decision to plead not guilty. On September 13, 2024, El Mayo, one of the most powerful and elusive figures in the world of Mexican drug cartels, was finally brought to face justice in the U.S. court system. As expected, Mayo didn't admit guilt. Instead, he pleaded not guilty to a laundry list of severe charges. These charges include drug trafficking, money laundering, and leading a criminal organization, all tied to the Sinaloa cartel, which he co-founded. Now let's break down the charges. Over the years, El Mayo has allegedly been responsible for the flow of vast amounts of drugs, particularly methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, into the United States. But that's not all. His cartel was also involved in illegal arms trafficking, extortion, and other brutal acts. The charges are so severe that experts are predicting Mayo could face life in prison, or even the death penalty. According to Al Jazeera, Mayo's charges are so severe that U.S. prosecutors are expecting a minimum penalty of a life sentence, and there is also the possibility of a death sentence. Now, this raises the stakes. A death penalty for a drug kingpin of Mayo's stature isn't common. Even El Chapo, who was convicted in 2019 of similar crimes, avoided it. So why is Mayo facing this possibility? Some experts believe it's because Mayo's crimes may be even worse, or perhaps the U.S. government wants to make an example out of him. El Chapo's trial brought a lot of attention to the Sinaloa cartel's violent tactics, but Chapo, during his trial, attempted to shift the blame for the cartel's most heinous crimes onto Mayo. He tried to paint himself as more of a middleman, while portraying Mayo as the true mastermind behind the bloodshed.
Son in Illinois on drug-related charges. Zambada waived these concerns, keeping his representation as is. The 76-year-old cartel leader appeared in poor health, entering the courtroom in a wheelchair and wearing a navy hoodie with jailhouse slippers. However, when asked about his condition, his attorneys gave no comment.
But here's the twist. Will these accusations come back to haunt Mayo in his own trial? During Chapo's trial, a lot of dirt was thrown at Mayo, and some of that might resurface in court. It could influence how the jury and the public see him. After all, Mayo has managed to stay under the radar for so long, but now, he's in the spotlight. His once shadowy reputation is facing a direct hit, and it's not just about the charges anymore. It's about how the world will see him once the trial gets underway. Public perception is critical in high-profile trials like this. While Chapo was infamous for his daring prison escapes and public persona, Mayo was always more of the quiet puppet master. This trial could expose just how deep his involvement in the cartel's worst crimes goes, and it's unlikely that the jury will be lenient if they find him guilty. The big question remains, will Mayo be able to dodge a death sentence, or is this the end for one of the most powerful drug lords in history? Whatever the outcome, the world will be watching closely.
Where one had previously represented other drug cartel members, and the other represented Zambada's son in Illinois on drug-related charges. Zambada waived these concerns, keeping his representation as is. The 76-year-old cartel leader appeared in poor health, entering the courtroom in a wheelchair and wearing a navy hoodie with jailhouse slippers.
In El Chapo's 2019 trial, the infamous drug lord made a surprising move. He tried to pin some of the most violent crimes committed by the Sinaloa cartel on his longtime ally, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. It was a bold attempt to shift blame, one that shocked many observers. But why would El Chapo, known for his ruthless leadership, throw his partner under the bus? Was it a strategy to get a lighter sentence, or was there some truth behind his claims? During the trial, El Chapo's defense argued that El Mayo was the real mastermind behind many of the Sinaloa cartel's bloodiest and most brutal actions. According to El Chapo, Mayo had remained in the shadows for years, quietly pulling the strings, while others, like Chapo himself, took the fall for the cartel's worst crimes. Chapo's lawyers suggested that El Mayo's low profile helped him escape the law for so long, allowing him to continue running the cartel without facing the consequences. As Al Jazeera reported, in his 2019 trial, El Chapo sought to shift blame for the Sinaloa cartel's most violent acts onto Zambada. But was El Chapo just trying to save himself? Many experts believe that Chapo's accusations were part of a desperate strategy to avoid harsher punishment. After all, Chapo knew he was likely facing a life sentence, and blaming El Mayo might have seemed like a last-ditch effort to reduce his time in prison. But even with these accusations, Chapo couldn't escape his fate. He was sentenced to life in prison.
The DEA estimates that Guzman Lopez and his brothers operated nearly a dozen in Sinaloa last year, producing up to 5,000 pounds of per month, which U.S. authorities say was trafficked to more than 50 countries.
The big question now is whether these accusations will resurface in El Mayo's upcoming trial. If they do, how much credibility will they have? While Chapo's claims grabbed headlines, many experts argue that El Mayo has been involved in some of the cartel's darkest moments. For decades, Mayo has been a key player in the Sinaloa cartel, and it's possible he orchestrated crimes even worse than those Chapo was convicted for. As Mayo's trial approaches, many are wondering if similar accusations will be brought against him. Will the court dig deeper into Chapo's claims? Could El Mayo's secretive leadership be exposed even further? One thing is clear. This trial has the potential to reveal more about the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel and could finally put the spotlight on a man who has stayed in the shadows for far too long. When El Chapo, one of the world's most infamous drug lords, was finally captured and put on trial, many people thought he would get the death penalty, but to the surprise of many, El Chapo avoided it. How? Let's break it down. First, let's look at why El Chapo didn't face the death penalty in the US. Even though his crimes were beyond brutal, he ordered murders, ran a massive drug empire, and was responsible for endless violence. The US legal system has very specific guidelines when it comes to the death penalty. In federal cases, the death penalty is typically reserved for crimes like murder, terrorism, or espionage. While El Chapo was behind countless murders, most of his crimes fell under drug trafficking, which doesn't automatically qualify for a death sentence under US law. Another important point is that El Chapo wasn't directly charged with committing murder himself during his trial. The prosecution focused more on his leadership in the drug trade rather than linking him to specific murders. This distinction helped him avoid the death penalty. It's also worth noting that when El Chapo was extradited to the US from Mexico, there was an agreement between the two countries that he wouldn't face the death penalty. Mexico, where the death penalty is abolished, has a strict policy of only extraditing suspects if the receiving country promises not to execute them. That's another major reason why El Chapo wasn't sentenced to death.
The 76-year-old cartel leader appeared in poor health, entering the courtroom in a wheelchair and wearing a navy hoodie with jailhouse slippers. However, when asked about his condition, his attorneys gave no comment.
Now, what about El Mayo? His situation might be different. Like El Chapo, Mayo has a long list of criminal activities, including drug trafficking. But some legal experts believe his crimes might be viewed as even more severe. Why? Because El Mayo has been in the game much longer than El Chapo and is considered one of the masterminds behind the rise of the Sinaloa cartel. He's been linked to more violent acts, including the deaths of law enforcement officials, which could weigh heavily against him in court. Plus, while Chapo's trial didn't focus on murder charges, Mayo could face a trial where prosecutors emphasize the violent outcomes of his operations. This could put the death penalty back on the table. Unlike Chapo, Mayo's crimes might include direct orders for killings, which could trigger a harsher sentence. Mayo's upcoming trial may be different from Chapo's because the US legal system has learned from the past. Prosecutors might push harder for the death penalty this time, especially given the ongoing fight against the powerful Sinaloa cartel. El Mayo's age and his vast influence over the cartel make him a significant target, and taking him down with the most severe punishment could send a message to other cartel leaders. There's also the matter of legal precedents. While the US doesn't frequently use the death penalty in drug trafficking cases, there have been instances where particularly violent or high-profile criminals have faced it. If prosecutors can tie Mayo directly to murders or acts of terrorism, they could push for the death penalty. Mayo's trial could end up setting a new precedent, especially since his criminal activities span decades and involve brutal violence. In short, El Chapo avoided the death penalty due to legal technicalities and agreements with Mexico. But for El Mayo, the stakes could be much higher. Whether or not he faces the death penalty depends on how his crimes are framed in court. But one thing's for sure, he's in for the fight of his life.
I don't think you're going to see a reduction in the fentanyl because the cartel remains intact. And it's not only them, but you also have a very, very powerful and very violent drug organization by the name of Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
When it comes to El Mayo's upcoming trial, his defense team is expected to pull out all the stops to try and save him from a harsh sentence. One of the strategies they're reportedly planning to use is claiming that El Mayo was a kidnapping victim. Yes, you heard that right. One of the most notorious cartel leaders in the world, responsible for countless violent acts, is now trying to say he was forced into committing crimes. According to this defense, Mayo will argue that he was abducted and made to participate in the cartel's operations under duress. But the big question is, does this claim have any merit, or is it simply a desperate ploy to gain sympathy from the court and avoid what's likely to be a death sentence or life behind bars?
The next issue was over the number of co-defendants involved in this case. U.S. prosecutors said they were working to figure out if the government wanted to move forward, trying Zambada separately or with these co-defendants.
Let's break it down. Mayo has been involved in organized crime for decades, building one of the most powerful drug empires in the world. The idea that he was kidnapped and forced into criminal activities doesn't really add up when you look at the facts. For years, Mayo was known to be a highly strategic and ruthless leader. He wasn't just a participant, he was running the show. His defense team will likely try to paint a picture of Mayo as a victim of circumstance, someone who was caught up in something far beyond his control. But experts are already skeptical. As a recent article pointed out, despite his defense team's efforts to portray him as a kidnapping victim, experts suggest that this strategy will likely fall flat, given his extensive involvement in crimes far worse than kidnapping. In other words, it's hard to convince a jury that someone with Mayo's history was forced into anything. This defense could be seen as a last-ditch attempt to reduce his sentence. Mayo knows he's facing serious charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and countless acts of violence tied to the Sinaloa cartel. With these charges, a life sentence is almost certain, and the possibility of a death sentence is looming large. So, claiming to be a victim of kidnapping could be Mayo's Hail Mary, a way to shift the narrative and paint himself in a more sympathetic light.
The Sinaloa cartel, alongside El Chapo, had been managing the business side of the criminal enterprise before it split into factions. The DEA had been offering up to $15 million for his arrest or any information that could lead to it, while Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons, took on a significant role within the cartel after his father's arrest back in 2017.
But here's the issue. This strategy seems completely at odds with his long-standing reputation as a ruthless cartel leader. For years, El Mayo was the mastermind behind the Sinaloa cartel's rise to power. He wasn't a pawn in someone else's game. He was the one making the moves, calling the shots, and ordering brutal hits on anyone who crossed him. So, convincing a court that he's suddenly the victim may be a tough sell. There's another layer to this: Mayo's alleged dealings with U.S. authorities, particularly the DEA and FBI. It's been reported that he might have had some level of cooperation with law enforcement, possibly to protect himself or his family. If that's true, it could completely undermine his kidnapping defense. Why? Well, if Mayo was in communication with the DEA or FBI, that implies he had a certain level of agency and control over his actions. If he was truly a kidnapping victim, it's unlikely he would have been able to negotiate with U.S. law enforcement or strike deals. Instead, it suggests that Mayo was actively managing his criminal operations, even while supposedly being under duress. This puts his defense in a tough spot. On one hand, they want to argue that he was forced into criminal activities, but on the other hand, there's evidence that Mayo was a willing and active participant in the Sinaloa cartel's operations, even working with U.S. authorities at times.
Sources also indicate that El Chapo's son arranged for the pair to be flown to the border to inspect some property, but when the pilot landed, FBI agents were waiting for the drug lord known as El Mayo.
The potential outcome of Mayo's trial is huge. A life sentence, or even the death penalty, would be a massive blow to the Sinaloa cartel. It could send shockwaves through the cartel world, with rivals like CJ&G eager to swoop in and seize control. This trial could mark the end of an era for the Sinaloa cartel, and the consequences will be felt in every corner of the drug trade. At the end of the day, Mayo's story is a grim reminder of the high cost of a life of crime. No matter how much power you have, the consequences eventually catch up to you. And in Mayo's case, those consequences might just be a life behind bars, or worse. Let us know what you think in the comments. Is Mayo's trial the end of the Sinaloa cartel as we know it? Will other cartels take advantage of the situation? We want to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into the cartel world and other shocking stories. Stay tuned for more.